Bret. Stevens for the motion.
Well, like Claudia, I want to preface my comments by reminding all of you of what it is we are debating here. Claudia, Michael, and I are not on this stage to argue that Russia is an enemy of the United States, and you, as the audience, are not here to vote on whether or not that proposition is true. Rather, we are here to make the case that Russia is becoming an enemy. So what's at issue here is the trend, the direction, the question of where all this is going. So let me devote my time to looking at, in a very factual way, how events have unfolded in just the past year. Let me remind you that we are on the eve of the anniversary of the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. Let me remind you also that Alexander Litvinenko was a British subject. He was murdered by a lethal dose of polonium-210, which was a de facto case of nuclear homicide, if not nuclear terrorism. From his deathbed, Litvinenko personally accused Vladimir Putin of ordering the assassination. Since then, Scotland Yard has pinned the murder on a Russian businessman, an ex, or if you will, current FSB man named Andrei Lugovoy. In July, the British Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, noted that, quote, the Russian government has failed to register either how seriously we treat this case or the seriousness of the issues involved. The Russian Foreign Ministry responded with a brush-off that they could not understand why Britain would hazard its relationship with Russia, quote, for the sake of one man. For the sake of one man. Let me remind you that liberal democracy is constructed for the sake of one man. In a month's time, Mr. Lugovoy, Litvinenko's killer, is likely to be elected a member of the Russian parliament. In December of 2006, the Kremlin pulled the rug out from the largest foreign investment to date in Russia, which was Shell's $20 billion oil and gas project on Sakhalin Island using transparently phony regulatory excuses. It happened again in June to British Petroleum. The assault on foreign investment in Russia was the natural extension of the illegal seizure of Russia's privately held energy assets, particularly those of Yukos and its CEO, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, whose prison term in a Siberian labor camp has recently been extended. In January, Mr. Putin forced the Belarusian government to sign a new gas contract or else have its gas supplies turned off in the dead of winter. Now, Belarus is not a friend of the United States, but Ukraine and Georgia are friends of the United States, and in both cases, Mr. Putin had previously used what I would call pipeline warfare to threaten his neighbors, to threaten and bully his neighbors at their coldest and most vulnerable moments. In the next month, in February, a man named Ivan Safronov, a reporter for the Kommersant newspaper, fell from a fourth-story window onto the street, where he died instantly. The authorities ruled it a suicide, but most observers believed that Safronov, who had repeatedly embarrassed the Russian military with his reporting, was executed, making him the 14th such journalist killed, murdered, during Mr. Putin's reign. The same month, a Russian court condemned 9 members of the ethnic minorities rights group Froda for having a quote-unquote unsanctioned tea with 2 German students. Quote, we were told that under the new law on NGOs, any meeting of 2 or more people with a purpose of discussing publicly important issues has to be sanctioned by the local administration 3 days in advance, Froda's director told London's Daily Telegraph. The next month, in March, an American Russia analyst named Paul Joyal was shot outside his home in suburban Maryland shortly after meeting a former KGB general. 4 days before that shooting, on Dateline NBC, Mr. Joyal had noted that, quote, a message has been communicated to anyone who wants to speak out against the Kremlin. If you do, no matter where you are, we will find you and we will silence you in the most horrible way possible, end of quote. The next month, in April, Mr. Putin indicated that he intended to withdraw Russia from the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, one of the landmark agreements ending the Cold War. He has since indicated that he is prepared to withdraw Russia from the 1987 Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty signed by Reagan and Gorbachev. The next month, in May, ethnic Russians rioted in the city of Tallinn when the Estonian government decided to remove a World War II monument to their Soviet liberators. Estonia was subject to a concerted cyber attack, and its ambassador in Moscow was attacked by youth protesters, almost certainly belonging to a neo-fascist group known as Nashi. I should remind you that Estonia is a member of NATO and the European Union. In June, Mr. Putin warned that if the US deployed just 10 ballistic missile interceptors in Poland, then Russia will, quote, have to get new targets in Europe. Which weapons will be used, he said, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, or some completely new systems? That's a technical matter. In July, Mr. Putin took a vacation. In August, Russia detained a mainstream business journalist for the Vedomosti paper, a paper that is partly owned by Dow Jones, on suspicion of so-called extremist activity via a law that defines the term extremist so broadly that it can be used to target ordinary political critics of the Kremlin. Russia also resumed, and this is notable, a policy of sending its heavy bombers out on long-range sorties. On more than several occasions, Norwegian, British, and finally American fighters have been forced to scramble into the air in order to intercept these Russian bombers, the first time this has happened since the Cold War. In September, Mr. Putin appointed an unknown apparatchik, Mr. Viktor Zubkov, as prime minister, and later announced that he himself may become prime minister in the next government, which is contrary to every prior promise he has made that he would leave the political scene when his presidential term expires. This sets the scene for the youthful Mr. Putin to remain in power for a very long time indeed.
1 minute.
In October, Mr. Putin became the first Russian leader to visit Tehran since Joseph Stalin in 1943. He said Iran's purposes are entirely peaceful. Russia has stopped cooperating with the rest of the Security Council on the UN, forcing the U.S. to resort to unilateral sanctions. And finally, I would like to make one point. Just last week, George W. Bush insisted in a speech that Russia is not an enemy of the United States. Now, if that does not convince this audience that our side is right, I don't know what will. Thank you very much.